So today I'm going to be talking to you about my tech journey, and then I'll go on to talking a little bit about scaling in Azure, which really is part of my tech journey and some of the things that I've done. So just to cover that again, what's in the box about me, my tech journey, scaling in the cloud with Azure. So who am I? My name is Efua Akumanyi. I'm currently the head of tech and training at Coding Black Females. And as Amy lovely described just earlier, went through very, very well, I'm also the co-founder and head of tech at Furnished, and I have a tech training program for business owners that I run through digibright.co.uk. So let's start at the very beginning. Okay, the beginning, I'm born, I grew up. Then some stuff happened. I went through my normal kind of channels, went through primary school, secondary school, got to my A levels, and all of that history, I basically was interested in tech, but maybe more robotics and electronics. But that was just a personal passion. I was much more interested in arty kind of things. So my A levels actually had nothing to do with tech. They were all to do with biology, psychology, and English literature. And for some reason, I just felt like that wasn't the thing that I was going to end up doing. And I had to look around really hard to see what I was interested in, and maybe also being one of many siblings, what was I going to do that wasn't going to tread on my siblings' toes? And again, art had been taken, biology had been taken. I decided to do computers and computer science because I was probably the most technically proficient in my family. And I went on to look around and see what I could do and where it could overlap with my kind of love of art. So I had a look at computer graphics, and I had a look at computer vision. And for some reason or other, one or more reasons, the university that I did the program that was the best was too far, or things like that. I ended up going to University of Sussex and doing a BSc in computer science and artificial intelligence. So that was actually more solidly tech than maybe I'd even envisioned myself being involved with. And it just so happens that computer science and artificial intelligence has, as you may all know, become, especially artificial intelligence, has become the thing that people talk about nowadays. And I did this decades ago. So I learned about all the kind of beginnings of AI and up until, I don't know, machine languages and neural networks, all of that stuff was covered in my degree. But nobody really around was doing that when I left university and I finished. So I ended up going into medical software, and that was mainly because the language one of the languages that I picked up at university was something called Prolog. If anybody has any idea about what Prolog is, it's a logic programming language, and it's a declarative language, and it's almost like a lot of pattern matching to get to the point. I have a Prolog joke that I'm tempted to tell, but maybe not not now, because I don't know how many Prolog lovers there are out there, but I might do later. But the company that I ended up working for had kind of a requirement for Prolog developers, and there weren't a lot of Prolog developers out there. So I ended up going to work for a medical software company for about 9 years, and I progressed from very much a junior programmer with a background in at uni. I left with like skills in Java, MATLAB, C, Perl, things like that, databases, Oracle. And the medical software company really was focused on one Prolog, and the other side was very much Microsoft technologies. So back then it was VB6, and that was their main focus, and that was the things that they programmed in most. And then it kind of evolved to .NET when VB6 kind of fell out of favor and was not supported anymore. So I spent most of my career, I would say, at the beginning of my career at least, working with .NET technologies and getting to grips with that in the medical software field. Basically programming systems that helped GPs make decisions. And that was one of the main aims of the tools that we were creating there, as well as support for clinical trial software. But after spending 10 years in one field and learning one stack very, very well, I became really aware that although I loved this medical software company, it was a great place to be. It was very close to academia for me, very academic people, very open about learning and sharing knowledge, all great big tick boxes for going to your first job. I wasn't learning all the things. I became very, very passionate about tech, and I was very interested in, and I didn't feel like I was getting enough of the knowledge of the different systems and available things that were out there. As a result, I thought the fastest way to do that, and probably maybe some of the scariest ways, is to become a contractor. So I went from essentially having one job interview and getting a job for 10 years to becoming a contractor. And contracting, it definitely upped my skill set a lot. I saw so many different systems and so many different verticals, so many different types of companies. I went from legal to working in the charity sector, to insurance tech, to education and banking, and a number of those were startups as well. So I did that for, again, another nearly 9 years. And like I said, you work. I worked in big teams. I worked in teams where I was only person. I was technical architecting things. I was leading sometimes some of these teams, and moving software systems from legacy to newer developments, upskilling, moving monoliths to microservices. I did so much in that, and it was really a fast steep learning curve, and a good way to kind of gain so many different skills in so many different areas. And so while I was working on that, I obviously had worked in many different startups, and I started to, in the back of my mind, I think I always felt quite entrepreneurial, and I always had this passion of maybe starting my own company one day. But I had maybe this concept that you have to have some sort of special magic source or some class or some skill out there that meant that until you had that, you couldn't start your own business. Having experienced loads of startups, I realized that everybody was really just learning on the job. There's no real kind of toolkit to creating your own startup and running it. So with that being said, with all kind of the skill sets that I've learned and all of the knowledge that I gained, I decided to co-found a company, and that was Furnishful. And I'll talk a little bit about Furnishful in the second half, because that's that kind of really does go in line with scaling in Azure, and creating and moving essentially code from maybe monolithic on-sites to a cloud service. So I'll talk about that in a little bit detail in the second half. But I co-founded this business, and it became like my passion, and we built this system, went through different iterations and various iterations to end up with Furnishful as it is today and running in its current guise. But while I was on my long journey, I also felt that looking around me, I happened to always be pretty much the only female developer. Maybe I've met maybe one or two other women developers, but I was definitely the only Black developer I knew out there as well. And so I just couldn't accept that I was the only Black woman developer who was a back-end developer. So technical and very, very kind of into my tech. I knew there had to be other women out there like me. So I kind of went on a little bit of a search, and I found an organization. Well, at that point, it was really just a group on Meetup called Coding Black Females. Obviously, my search terms picked up exactly what I was looking for, and I found this company, this group of women who, again, were like me, had programmed for many years and couldn't seem to find, or didn't end up working with women like them, and they were just curious and wanted to have and meet other women like us. So what we ended up doing was meeting in a WeWork space, about 10 women back in 2016, and just trying to put on events and trying to create this community of women and this community of support. And eventually this, over the years, grew from those 10 women in a room to 5,000 members, putting on events now virtually that hundreds of people go to. And in fact, we also do training programs, boot camps, we have mentorship programs. It just grew from something very small to a really, really huge community. But also on my journey, I found that working as a basically co-founding my own company, I also found that a lot of the women who I was on this kind of journey to creating a company with, who weren't technical, were really struggling to get their tech up and running. They're really struggling with problems like understanding what they were getting built, trying to talk to their developers. Some people had terrible experiences where, you know, developers would maybe not deliver or deliver something that really wasn't fit for purpose, or would withhold their code base from them. And so I put together a course that could help essentially train non-techs to understand the tech in their business enough for them to essentially be their own CTOs. That was the whole premise behind it. And I have that training program, and I still have it available, and I run it when needed. So that's DigiBright. And I talked a lot about coding Black females and joining that, but this kind of all happened around the same time. So it's not really a timeline. It's not such a formal kind of like timeline. But who knows what's going to happen next with all this? I'm still working at Coding Black Females. I am still running DigiBright, and I still have Furnished, and it still runs in the background there. So just to go back a little bit to the technical part. So go right back to Furnished, and let's talk about what Furnished is, and also what maybe some of the stages that Furnished has gone through from, you know, maybe something that's sat on an on-premise site to being in the cloud and somewhat scalable, well, quite scalable, and serves many thousands of users. So Furnished, what is it? It's a furniture and home decor discovery site. So we make it easy for users to discover and shop for beautiful items of furniture and home decor. That's our reason for existence, and that's what we're here to do. And that's what users see when they approach the site. It looks and presents itself like it's a shop, but it's an aggregation of multiple products. And so behind the scenes, what is it? It's a product aggregation tool where we process millions of products from feeds, from multiple feeds. It consumes and it connects to multiple APIs. And functionality-wise, we have a mood board functionality, which essentially allows people to put together rooms of products and store them and understand the costing around them. We also the actual background services where we store hundreds of thousands of images, because users are able to create those mood boards on the fly whenever they want, as well as all the product images, as well as all the other content that we have on the site. We also have registered user profiles, and we have a full text search, a full text search. And so that's what's going on, some of what's going on in the background. There's a lot more functionality than that, but this is kind of giving you a good overview of some of the things and some of the tools that we actually have on the site. So initially, when I built the very first minimum viable products, the very first MVP of Furnished, it was a PHP WordPress site. So quite monolithic. It sat on a very, very basic server, and it really wasn't Furnished in its first guise. It was actually an electronics product store that compared electronic products, but it was really the proof of concept, and it was really about getting this product out there quickly and seeing if people would go through the process and purchase things like the way we assumed they would. And so once we got to the stage where we did realize that this worked, it was about adding functionality, and I started off adding functionality through coding like plugins to work with the WordPress website. Got to a certain point where the functionality that we required was outside of the plugins that I could create using PHP. My background, as I explained, is mostly in .NET. Even though I worked in many different languages now, I still have that solid base there. So it was about looking to see what would. It got to the point where basically it didn't make sense to spend so much time working in something like PHP, and the decision was it makes sense to move to a language which we could quickly code something in and retain the flexibility, the functionality, and extendability of of the system. And that made sense to do it in .NET. And so looking around, there are many, many different cloud services out there, but it made sense if you're doing things in .NET to move to Azure services, because again, it complements the skill sets of the team. So that was one of the decisions behind it. So we have this monolith at the moment. We have this big WordPress system, which has grown and is successfully running. One of the other areas in which there was a problem is the system that we had it on. So the service or the provider that we had it with had a security breach. So this was outside of the code. It had nothing to do with the code itself, but we spent a long time wondering whether WordPress was, or WordPress has a multitude of plugins, and one of the considerations you have to think about is when you're having and importing external plugins into your system, what is the security of that system that's been created by a third party? What, does it have any loopholes? Does it have any ways and backdoors for people to get into the system? So even though that wasn't the cause, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether it was the cause. It turned out it was actually the provider that the whole system was sitting on had a security breach. And so somebody kind of messed with the initial version of the site. And that was a massive alarm bell. So one of the biggest considerations when moving our tool, the whole system, to the cloud was, one, it needed a rewrite so that we could rapidly develop, rapidly test, we could extend the functionality, and we could also recreate the existing functionality that we had. It had to be cost effective, and now security was a huge priority. So moving to a well-established cloud provider helped with some of that security. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the types of things that we did to help with the other issues or other requirements that we had. So moving to the cloud with Azure. So we had already built this MVP, and what we had to do was test and see what the current workloads were. So we used tools that were out there, and again, familiar with, such as JMeter, to kind of try and understand the throughput, understand the scale, understand what kind of load we were going to expect, and what load we were already dealing with. And then we had to try and plan and anticipate the scaling needs of the future, because we were going to change almost the product base of the site. So we knew that we were going to have to consider things like seasonal peaks and promotional peaks. So when, around Christmas, people might buy loads of things. Turned out actually that it's around summer as well. There's a huge peak in things like garden furniture that really affects your site. You've got to be able to map these things and understand them. And also when you're pushing out promotions there could be a massive spike. And so you've got to be able to anticipate that. And yes, you could buy a system maybe, or you could put it on an on-prem system or have it on some sort of infrastructure that is huge and can then handle the peaks, but then you've got the cost considerations of maintaining that, while just to be able to deal with those kind of spikes. And we didn't want that. So some of the things that we were considering, and this goes goes in line with something called the WellArchitected Framework, which is something that's out there you can find and have a look at. It's provided by Azure. I think AWS has one as well, and I suspect GCP probably does as well. So Google Cloud probably has one as well. But it's the concept of what you have to look at to have well-architected frameworks or software systems. So you're thinking about performance, you're thinking about reliability, security, cost estimation, and operational excellence. All of the things that I kind of was considering when moving from one service provider to another. It was all of those considerations that were coming into play. Some were more important than others, but they all had a factor. So I had a look out there, all the different cloud service providers out there, because you don't have to, just because you might have a strength in .NET doesn't mean you have to stick with Azure systems. But I did I kind of looked at all the different ones out there. And again, time considerations about how long it's going to take to develop something with the current skill set of the team, as opposed to building it with something they're very, very familiar with, and there is a tie. It's easier to kind of move a system into. I know we were redeveloping from PHP, but it made sense to do it to .NET, and so that made sense to do it in Azure. So I had a look at all the different types of services that these cloud service providers had, and what with the existing functionality we had, how were we going to break it up and what were we going to move it to? Was it going to be more of a lift and shift and just dump onto a VM? that was a consideration, that was a possibility, but it also meant that the scaling would have to happen offline, somewhat offline. That was, again, remember, this was a while ago. This isn't necessarily now. This was at the very beginning, maybe 2016 was when this was when we first released the first version of Furnished. So there was a consideration for that, and I ended up landing on PaaS services, and our concept, the flexibility that I could see, and the need to not manage all of the runtime, middleware, operating systems, all of that kind of stuff could be taken care of. I mean, there are pros and cons to that, but we're going to be taken care of by the vendor, by Azure. That really appealed. So it was really looking at things like PaaS and FaaS, so functions as a service and platform as a service. It turned out that some of that functionality ended up having to be infrastructure as a service, but I'll get to that. So PaaS, if people aren't familiar with it, is platform for service. It's a cloud computing model where a third-party provider delivers hardware and software tools to users over the internet. A PaaS provider hosts the hardware and software on its own infrastructure, but it's important to note that PaaS does not replace the company's entire infrastructure, and that's where that's kind of some of the things I'll talk about. I'll mention later on, but we were able to move a large amount of the infrastructure to PaaS services, so app services. But some of the code that was written did not transfer easily. And so we had to put that onto infrastructure services. So have a VM and maybe architect them as microservices that talked to the PaaS services. So managed services, look for areas in the architect where it may be natural to incorporate platform as a service. This is what I did. And then I looked at things like caching, queues and data storage. So where we're going to move on, what was the database going to be hosted on, where it was going to be. One of the requirements I had was that I built a lot of information when I first developed the service in .NET. It was modular but monolithic still, and it had reliance on a .NET, or I should say SQL Server back end, and a lot of the search considerations were tied to a full text search. But back when I was shifting the whole system to Azure, that back end, that full search functionality was not available. It hadn't yet. This is how new it was. It had not yet been implemented in the Azure cloud database services. So what we did was we moved the search to kind of Elasticsearch using Lucien.net, which allowed us to then partition that search functionality outside of the existing system. But that was only able to be done because there's been a lot of thought about the architecture and breaking it down into modular parts before moving it even onto the cloud. So thinking about how you're going to architect your actual existing structure, whether you're moving it to a monolith or more microservices, thinking about how you can break that down into components before you do that is very, very important. And it means that you can make those kind of quick decisions to take out a component and move it somewhere else because you've already partitioned all the systems and the code that you've written. So one of the reasons that I was thinking about moving it to PaaS was it can reduce the time and cost of managing servers, storage, networking, and other application infrastructure. So the concept of only paying for what you need made a lot of sense. Some of the other advantages: no maintenance, said that already, of systems and software. It eliminates the risk associated with acquiring and managing software licenses and maintaining basic infrastructure. Quick testing and deployment. So dynamic scaling up with demand and scaling back when demand is low. So thinking about those seasonal peaks or those unexpected peaks, having things that can respond to that, and also having the ability to quite easily scale up and scale down when necessary was extremely appealing. So also, not having to purchase potentially SQL Server licenses, which can become quite costly for a small company, as well as the SQL Server support that might come along with that. It was again a cost consideration, which was taken into account when moving to the PaaS. Some of the disadvantages of the system. Security is up to the cloud provider. Again, picking a cloud provider that has a good reputation can allow you to somewhat configure that. So PaaS, some of that's out of your control, but there's a lot of trust that you might have picking a provider like Azure. Infrastructure is not in your control, so it's solely dependent on your cloud provider's implementation. So again, you're relying on things being up to date and not changing when, and making things incompatible. At least getting some pre-warning. Existing infrastructure and legacy solutions may be incompatible. So, like as I was saying before, at the beginning, it was the full text search could not be moved over, so it meant having to think about another way of getting that search functionality in. So the other issue that you might have is there may be some vendor lock-in. So once you've done that and you've written your full stack or whatever, you've written your full system, microservices, whatever it is, and moved it over. If you move it with there may be some vendor locking, right? So you've written it in such a way that it's very hard to move it to any other cloud provider. Users cannot easily migrate that system, that service. However, things like containerization, using Docker, could get around that. So that is something to think about as well when you're trying to think about moving and scaling in the cloud. So just talked about moving and picking what kind of services were going to be used, but now it's about scaling in that cloud, in the cloud with Azure. So if you're familiar with how you cloud services work and how you scale, if you're not, I'm just going to cover it briefly. So you can scale up vertically, and you can do that by changing the pricing tier of an app service plan. So Azure has apps, in PaaS they have app service plans, and they have different plans. You have basic, standard, you have premium, and they have different costs associated with it, but they also have different compute power. So you can, without any downtime, it's very, very straightforward to actually just increase the size of your app with taking into consideration the costs that would be involved with that. So the scale-up operation in the Azure Web Apps is equivalent to moving your non-cloud website to a bigger physical server. You scale up operations are useful to consider when your site is hitting a quota, signaling that you are outgrowing your existing compute power. When you have your service in PaaS, you can use stuff like, you can use your own external systems to monitor, but you can also use internal systems such as application insights to understand what kind of load your system is having. You can see over time whether it's hitting limits, and then potentially you can accordingly create something that will allow you to just scale up vertically and handle all of that, or alternatively you can scale up when needed. But there are limits to scaling up. It gets to a certain point where maybe you want to consider price, and you don't want to have just a huge, massive system sitting there. So the other alternative is to scale horizontally, and I think horizontal scaling made a lot of sense for us. It made us more fault tolerant, it made us more robust, and we could scale out horizontally. So we did that by increasing the number of VM instances that run your app. So you're essentially having an exact copy of whatever apps or services you have, and you're able to ramp up horizontally by adding more servers to your system, or more identical services systems to be served by your users, to serve to your users. When Azure, with Azure, there are limits to the number of instances you are able to scale out to, depending on the pricing tier you're in. So there's approximately, you can have about 30 instances on the basic tier, and I think that increases to around 100 instances on the higher tiers out there. So scaling settings actually only does take seconds to apply, and it affects all the apps in your actual service plan. So you have multiple apps which you can do in one service plan, then you'll be scaling those too. So it might make, again, it's about considering how you're going to deploy and develop and keep as decoupled as possible your systems, so that you can maybe, wherever the bottlenecks are, increase it as you go along, as opposed to having, again, everything scale up at the same time. No redeployment necessary when you do this, and there's no downtime for your users, which is very nice. It's this very smooth process, and your users should not experience any kind of loss of functionality or loss of access. So the other thing I'm going to talk about finally is auto scaling. So auto scaling is the process of dynamically allocating resources to match performance requirements. And as demand slackens and the additional resources are now no longer needed, they can be deallocated to minimize the costs. So auto scaling takes advantage of the elasticity of the cloud hosted environments. And with Azure, it has an inbuilt auto scaling for you. So auto scale settings apply to all of the apps within the app service. And using something like Azure Functions, which is again fully managed, everything's managed for you. You're not even you're really just using something. You're just running functions. The actual functions, the only thing that you're managing. The actual code base itself is the only thing you're managing, and that means that you have this auto scaling inbuilt into your tool, and it will manage it for you. So as the need goes up, that will be managed for you. So rather than manually doing it, they automatically allocate compute power when your code is running and scaling out as necessary to handle load. Some of the considerations, because auto scaling isn't an instant solution, simply adding resources to a system or running more instances of a process doesn't guarantee that the performance of the system will improve. The system must be designed to be horizontally scalable. So, for example, don't make assumptions about your instance affinity. So one of the things that we had to consider when we were developing Furnished for is just how we were going to deal with that instance affinity. And you can have things like sticky sessions. We moved on all of our caching over to Redis cache. And all of those kind of things and considerations helped to make it easy for us to actually have auto scaling rules in place to allow us to not have to think about manually or even having something there that is more of a manual process to auto scale. It allowed us to be able to have an automated service that meant that our system could respond to demands and then scale down when needed. Okay, so that is a whistle-stop tour of how I got into development, and also some of the things that I've worked on when it comes to Azure and cloud and scaling and moving monoliths to modular services to microservices. So that's all, folks. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Indeed, there are. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I think we learned so much. But yeah, we might be able to get onto the questions. I think one of the questions that was first asked was, what made you interested in robotics?
Oh gosh, what made me interested? Probably films. Films, but also I have an older brother, and he used to get the coolest gifts ever, right? So we used to get like electronic toys from, I'm going to age myself again, a company called BT's, if anybody knows BT's. They're no longer around, and I used to stare in the shop window, noses and faces pressed to all the different gadgets and electronic things that you got to put together yourself. So I remember having experiences where he got really frustrated because he couldn't put things together, he couldn't work out how the motors work, whatever. And I would just sit there for hours constructing these things. And I just loved it. And then that kind of progressed to building my own PC as a, oh gosh, so nerdy, as kind of like a Christmas time treat for myself. I built my own SUSE Linux based system, because I was so used to using Microsoft systems, and I really wanted to have a look at the Linux world and learn for their board. Big old book, had a motherboard that talked to me. Loved it. So yeah, that's what first got me into robotics, kind of idea of robotics. I was also, when I went to university, one of the things, when I was looking at the different unis that were out there to pick, I remember going to one to Sussex, and they had these little kind of gadgets. So basically they created all these little robots, and they had written a software that they kind of made them almost like ants. So they would move away from each other and they'll know how to go. I was so sucked in. I was like, I want to do that. Didn't end up doing that, but I was like, they got us basically. They got everybody. Everyone was like, wow. So that's one of the things that got me to sign up for my course to be robotics.
The ants one, I would pay money to see that. That does sound incredibly cool. And we've just had a question come in from Anne. Have you thought about going multi-cloud?
You know, I am. It is multi-cloud. I really just stuck to the Azure because it was in my title. So yes, we actually do use some AWS services, especially to do with mail and to do with some of the notification streams out there. So that is something that is already done, and I'm constantly looking about how to optimize costs, efficiencies as much as possible. So I look at any cloud provider that there is out there. And especially when it comes to some of the services that we're kind of looking to implement to do with AI and vision and search. So there's all cloud providers give you this kind of inbuilt tool, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So having something that's multi-cloud and allows you to essentially search across that and aggregate that information and then produce the result is something I'm really looking into.
Wow, that is incredible. Thank you so much. And I suppose a question that I myself would also like to ask is, what are the barriers at the moment for women in tech, and how has this changed over the years that you've been able to see?
I think I say this quite often. I think one of the barriers, which is it's hard to even think about because it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, is it helps for you to see women out there and women like you doing that and in senior roles, in order for you to think that's a job that I can do. And so maybe having a place where women are more, having women in those kind of senior roles and more upfront and doing talks and out there can help encourage other women into getting into tech. There's also maybe a concept of, is tech for me? So that can help solve that as well. So a lot of the women that we talk to maybe didn't even consider tech as something that they would get into. And then also when you get into the company, you're faced with a room that, again, you don't feel free to be yourself in, because you feel a little bit uncomfortable bringing your whole self. So yeah, again, having more senior women in there and having more women in the industry, progressing in the industry, training to get into the industry will help with that. But I think those are some of the kind of the quick barriers that can be looked into.
Yeah, and it seems as though your work as well at Coding Black Females really looks into this and is creating that space as well. Could you tell us a bit more then about the learning and development opportunities at Coding Black Females?
Yes, absolutely. So with Coding Black Females, we run boot camps pretty much nearly every day now to help women become full stack programmers. So you don't have to have any experience in coding, and we will point you in the right direction to help you maybe get up to speed quickly before you begin the course. But we provide training on things like React, all the way from basically from HTML. Let me go even further, from command line arguments to HTML to JavaScript to React to databases in Mongo, and also I just missed out Node as a server backend. So we teach you how to become full stack developers. There are also training courses for leadership and technical architecture as well. So if you've been in tech for a while, you're a developer, you're wanting to go to the next level, there's also opportunities for you to do that there. We also provide mentorship as well. So if another really helpful way of maybe progressing in the tech field is to have a mentor to help build you with somebody to help guide you, someone else who's experienced it before, and also to help you maybe overcome some of the things that you don't even know you have. It's also very helpful, and build your network.
This is very true, actually, especially in terms of the mentorship. Is this something that you've also had and benefited from? Not
officially. I've kind of I have a lot of different mentors and a lot of people I look towards. I have a what I'd call a career coach, so maybe somewhat mentoring. I've had that for a number of years, and I think that he has helped me very much in understanding some of the barriers that I maybe have put on myself, and also accepting where I may have even blamed myself for certain things, and it's not my problem. So they can really help unblock you, and that's what I think what mentors can do for you too. So yeah.
It's true. It's actually very true. And I suppose if we fast forward to this pandemic that has been happening for what seems like a very crazy, almost 2 years, do you think actually that the adoption of cloud has increased because of COVID, or was it already on the rise?
It was definitely already on the rise. I mean, it was hugely on the rise. It kind of makes a lot of sense for cloud. And in fact, cloud and then the next level of cloud, which I'm not even going to go into. But as I said, I'm very technical, so I love all the stuff that's coming out right now to do with the future of tech. But I won't go into that right now. That's another discussion.
No, please do.
Yeah, okay. I'm just touching it. I'm just saying that there's a lot of stuff about distributed systems out there and decentralization that I'm really interested in, and how that can impact lots of things in the way that we operate and the way that we code.
I suppose then, also with future predictions for 2022 or even many years and beyond, what are you looking forward to? Where do you think Azure Cloud Services or any other services actually will be going?
I think that already there's been lots done in AI, and I feel like AI is kind of almost like falling a little bit out of favor again, but that isn't a problem because it's going to be around forever. It's about smartly incorporating it into the system and not just stamping it on and saying this is an AI system, but actually utilizing it so that it's seamless and people don't know that it's happening. So that's definitely something that is happening and is going to continue to happen, I think. But further and further down the line, it's definitely I'm looking and thinking about how services out there that are already out there, cloud services, and how they're going to be best served, how they're going to best serve this kind of new distributed way of thinking about apps and the way that and security and the way that people connect and network.
It is. It's very true. It's very, very true. Which I keep saying, which I keep repeating, because it is really good to know. And I think many people in the comments as well are echoing this. So in terms of the types of projects you've been involved with, what has been your favorite so far and why?
Oof. So I have to say Furnishful, because I simply know every tiny detail about it, right? So that has been something, technical projects that I've been involved with. I'm going to say that's probably one of the most exciting and fun and challenging and stressful things that I've done. But when it comes to projects outside of tech, or at least tech adjacent, then working with a company like Coding Black Females and working on with so many women who are discovering tech and are excited about tech, and companies who are interested in supporting us in that, it's really fulfilling.
And it seems it. Please do make sure as well, if you're in the comments or if you're watching, to go and check out Coding Black Females as well as Furnishful and Did You Write? But I suppose another question we could ask is, what advice would you give to yourself if you were just starting out again? So from all the experience that you've had, is there anything that you change? Is there anything that you would maybe go in early and change again?
Yes, I would probably say you don't need to stay 10 years in one company. Leave earlier, learn more, don't be afraid. I would also say talk to people more. I mean, it took me many years to realize the benefits of networking, and you can see somewhere, if you ever look at some of my Instagram profile pic is me looking at a phone, because it's really the only way people would recognize me at networking gigs, because that's what I would be doing. I didn't look around, I didn't really want to talk to anybody. I just sat in the corner on my phone thinking I don't really want to say anything. But it's so beneficial to have that network for so many different reasons. A lot of my job opportunities have come from networks, and when I was contracting, as well as companies who could help and support with that. But just knowing people makes a big difference in getting yourself out there. It also improves your communication skills and the way you can present technically, as well as just present yourself, and allow people to get to know you a little bit better. There's endless benefits to being able to talk. And as somebody who's actually more of a natural introvert, believe it or not, I can find it exhausting like everybody else, but you do that, and then you network, and you've achieved something, and then you can go back to your cave and your computer like I do. So, but yeah, push yourself to do that. I would say that's what I would tell myself back then. You know, put your hand up and say that thought before that other person says exactly the same thought that you were going to say in a meeting. You know?
This is great advice, exactly. Believe in yourself more, and the soft skills is something that we're also seeing a lot of developers are trying to also build as well. Another question that has come through is, what are your thoughts on blockchain and crypto? It's kind of out of left field.
That was my thoughts. I try to not say those key words because I know that they are kind of like, if you say blockchain and crypto, people start to, it kind of divides people, especially developers. It's like, it's so divisive. But yeah, distributed systems and blockchain and security, dApps, NFTs, very, very exciting. I don't want to go into it because I will talk about it all day, all the different types of chains out there. I'm fascinated with it. So at the moment, I'm really at the beginning of my journey. I'm really exploring all the kind of things like decentralization, whether it's DeFi, whether it's DAOs, all those kind of concepts out there, and how they are going to maybe allow people who are without banks to get onto that kind of the banks. That's the crypto side of things, but also how you can democratize almost like software development, and how you open source try to do that in a way, and how you can use distributed systems and blockchain to do that in a more efficient way. And I also love art, so NFTs make a lot of sense to me. So yeah,
it makes sense to me as well, but I think you're right, very divisive. The comments have started to go between the two. So maybe
it's a scam. It's not a scam, it's the future. I mean, so these are the questions that go around in my head too. So
it'll be very interesting to find out as the years go on as well. And do you think actually at the moment, so we know that Code and Black Females is doing a lot of work in this field and is really, really helping in terms of creating this community. Do you think enough is being done elsewhere as well to help Black women get into the tech industry?
I think there is definitely somewhat of a thought process shift, and it's exciting to see. And there are lots of communities that are out there that we work with as well, who have the same aligned principles as us in the concept of trying to increase from that dreadful 0.7% of Black women in tech to a much higher number, because it doesn't need to be that way. There are a lot of women out there. I've met a lot of them who are very excited about tech, and who are interested in programming, and who, you know, are available. So it's important for companies to reflect the world in which their tools are serving. So it's important. So yeah, it has to change, and it is changing, and we're hoping to help push that along as fast as possible.
That is absolutely amazing. And I believe David asked a few questions ago in terms of cloud, that they're trying to get certified by AWS. Do you think this is the best option among Azure as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty good way to do. Sometimes, you know, people can say certifications can be just for the sake of certifying someone, but I actually think learning you need to do to get a certification, especially if you've already worked in a cloud platform before, so you are familiar with terms, can be extremely beneficial to your team. So it will teach you about certain things that you may not have considered and may become applicable at a later date. Sometimes you learn a lot and it's not relevant, but having that knowledge means that later on down the line, think, hey, hang on a minute, I remember hearing about that particular aspect of that particular cloud system. Maybe that's applicable. So yeah, it's quite beneficial to do that. And I think you also get benefits by being cloud certified, or having a certain number of cloud certified solutions architects or developers in a company that come from those providers like Azure and AWS.
And why Azure versus AWS?
Just fully my .NET knowledge. It was so extensive, it just made sense. So and also I think when you're programming everything, you have the same things available across these different cloud services. It's just called something slightly different. So all I ended up doing when I did try and expand, and I have expanded to use different cloud services, is just say, you know, the name of it, whatever I was looking for, these, and usually you get the other system's name coming up, and it's much of a muchness. But so the only thing and the only factor that I could think of was how quickly and how could I understand the concepts, and could we understand the concepts, and so end up programming quickly for it. Subsequently, I've worked a lot in AWS, and I see the massive benefits. And I've also worked with other cloud computing back-end systems and databases, MySQL, MongoDB, all those kind of different NoSQL, all these kind of different systems. And I would say it's all about producing what it makes sense for your team and your software system, whether that's a cross-cloud system, one particular system, off-premises, on-premises, half, whatever it is. It's really about what you're building and what makes sense for you to be able to support that.
This is, absolutely correct. And I believe many people would agree as well. And even just from the way you're speaking, it shows that you do know what you're talking about. However, when you were talking before, you were saying your advice to your younger self, or to people just starting out, is to believe in yourself. So in your experience, do you think that being a woman in your profession comes with extra mental challenges that you have to overcome? For example, imposter syndrome, where you're doubting your own ability, but actually you can do it?
Constantly, and it never goes away. I don't believe it does get quieter every now and then whenever you have to learn a new stack or new concept or do something that's out of your comfort zone, it will rear its head again. But I think I take massive comfort in that it's not just for women in tech. I've come to subsequently know that everybody has imposter syndrome, and I think I take comfort also knowing that if I didn't, there probably would be an issue. If I didn't have a little bit of doubt, then maybe something to look at. Maybe something to look at. And in fact, imposter syndrome, it has fueled me to maybe do my research, make sure I know what's going on, understand as much as I can, so that I realize that you can't understand everything. So just get over it. Almost, you'll never know. You're not Google or the encyclopedia. You're just never going to know everything. But have comfort in knowing that nobody knows everything, and that what you don't know, you can learn.
This is great advice that I definitely also need to take on board. It's true, you can't know everything, so there's no point always worrying about what you don't know, but as much as you want to learn is really, really good. Also, are there any volunteer opportunities for Coding Black Females at the moment?
There are tons of Coding Black Female volunteers, volunteer needs, and anyone can volunteer. We're very open to that. We have several training programs running right now, so we're always looking for mentors and also teaching assistants to join the sessions to help with that particular stack that I mentioned. So if you have any knowledge of HTML, JavaScript, React, Node, MongoDB, it'll be, we're really open to having your support to help us, help these women learn.
That's incredible. And for you, what is the best part actually about working for Coding Black Females?
Again, it's just all of the people I meet and making a difference, knowing that, and hearing some of the stories that come back from women who found opportunities purely from coming to an event, even so being introduced to a company, and then being able to put themselves out there, going through the training programs, and going from low income to jobs that are really changing their lives financially. I mean, it's really, really encouraging. It's lovely to hear.
It's amazing. And I suppose just briefly before we finish, and thank you for being such an amazing speaker today, when it comes to learning a new tech stack and all of these types of opportunities, where do you begin? What is your base? Where would you start? What advice would you give to other people that are trying to tackle something new?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so don't worry about being massively proficient in all of them. Look at them, look at a few, get a little bit of an intro into them. So if you, for me, I went down the .NET route because it was the company that I worked in for a long time, but I did come from like having a bit of Java, a bit of other languages, different types of languages. So don't worry about specializing. Find a language that you like, then learn it as well as possible. And what you will find is that any subsequent language, there's a lot of overlap. So the basics will always be there that you can apply from language to language. And then the nuances are the bit that become, that you have to do more research on for looking at best practices, and finding out, the tricks and trades of particular systems and how they run across CPUs and various things. You can learn that. But having a general good knowledge of one language that you're comfortable will help you transfer that across other languages. That's what I found.